Welcome to the Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
And Jared, please tell us, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, we're going to be talking about a very important topic called continuous integration. And sometimes this is just abbreviated as CI. So Juan, could you give us a little explanation of what CI is from a high level before we get into it?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, use high level. There's different parts, right? So you probably have heard terms like CI, CD, right? So we're gonna just be covering continuous integration, right? So continuous integration, it's that process that helps integrate your code changes into a main branch or a main repository. And this is very crucial when you have a lot of software engineers or a bigger team or a larger engineering team, or even more 2020, 2021 monorepos, right? They're so popular for the past 5 years that you have a lot of contributors. So continuous integration is a crucial step in the process that ensures that you have high confidence and high quality in the code, but also it makes sure that you can integrate small chunks and small changes or small features, right, as they're complete into the main branch. So I haven't really said what continuous integration does or how it works, right? Just high level, what is it about? Don't confuse it with continuous deployment or continuous delivery. That's the CD part. We're not going to even cover that. So if you want to know about it, go ahead and Google it. Just continuous integration. So that's just high level there, Jared.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation on it right there. One thing that I think about when I think about continuous integration is, I'm sure a lot of engineers have had this experience before. I know newer engineers might not have, but when you're working on a team and you, let's say, in the morning, you pull down the code from the repository and then you try to build it and run it and you're like, oh, it didn't work. It broke, right? And then you have to then open up your Slack and say, who broke the build, right? Well, thankfully with continuous integration, one of the great things it does for us is it will let us know when code is pushed to a branch in a shared repository, in the remote repository, and when the build has failed, or if, for some other reason, some other set of tests have failed. So that's one of the most useful things, is that even if you push up code, could be work, as I think Juan said this before, hey, it works on my machine, right? But when you go to push it up to the repository, you want to know that it also works up there. And that's kind of what continuous integration does for us. But Juan, so let's start getting into it a little bit more. What are kind of the steps of what starts off the pipeline, or what is a pipeline?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So pipeline, right? You introduced that concept there. So when we talk about pipelines, it's very common to talk about pipelines when we talk about continuous integration. Pipeline is that, like, the process of the different steps that are going to be executed when you perform a commit to a remote branch. And when I say remote branch, is like, let's say you do commit using Git. You do your commit, that's locally on your computer, but until you don't push it, that doesn't go to the remote branch. Once it's pushed, that's when continuous integration kicks in, if you have it configured. So the pipeline is the set of steps of what it needs to happen after you push the code, right? And until it says that, hey, the code is ready, or the code is actually good, or the build is green. And we have that concept of a passing build or a failing build. Kind of like when we talk about tests, we have passing and failing, and those are very common statuses. There's also no status when it's a noun. It depends on the system. So the pipeline is those steps, but those steps are defined by the engineering team or the engineer setting up the pipeline. Usually we have a manifest, or we can do it from a UI system. So we're going to talk more about that. But really, like, when we talk about the build, let's talk about that. So build is just these different steps that need to happen for you to be able to run your software or your application. So for example, to give you a better idea, let's say you're working with React. So when you build your React application, what you need to do is clone the code, because you don't have the code. So you clone the code, right? You do your yarn or npm install, then you run your build, right? Maybe then after it's built the application, maybe build in production mode, really, right? and then maybe run the unit test or running the integration test, depending what you have there. So you see all those different steps. Those steps that you manually do when you get your code to run it locally for the first time, that's what continuous integration, the pipeline, that's what the pipeline is about, those steps. We can configure those steps in a manifest, and we're going to talk more about that later, or we can configure in a UI. Like imagine from a UI system, you add those steps. So we need to talk about the continuous integration platforms as well, but that's just the high level about the pipeline. Pipeline, the steps for that need to happen for the application to be, ready to be executed. So there's just the steps.
Yeah, no, you did a great job, Juan, explaining all those details. Yeah, and so what Juan just explained there are just the steps that instead of having to kind of do those manually on your own machine every single time before you push, which is still a good practice to make sure that you run those things locally. But, when you push it up, you can also know for sure, feel really confident that everything is going to be working once you push it up.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about how, this code, where is this code executed, Jared? Like this is, so I want to be clear with the audience that when continuous integration kicks in, this code and these steps are run in a remote machine. So let's talk about that, about like that remote machine. What are the common names for that? What systems are there available for that, right? So the first step is like kind of like we have to pick a system, but let's kind of like explain that process, Jared.
Yeah, so, like Juan is saying, I mean, there's going to be some sort of distinct machine that's going to be running these. I'm not sure exactly if there's a specific name that you're going for to name these.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's different names. So these machines, usually they're called either minions or agents or build agents. And those are the common names that depending on the system you use. But really what it means, it can be just a virtual container, like a Docker container, or it can be an actual physical machine somewhere. Like it depends how you configure this. If you're self-hosting, it could be even your own computer if you wanted it that way, right? Running a Docker container, but it's usually this machine that has a clean state, meaning that there's some things pre-configured, but there's no dependencies. There's no, maybe there's environment variables at most, but it's a clean state. So then we don't run into that. It works on my machine, right? So Jared, what systems are there available, or what systems have you worked with for continuous integration? Because that's one of the important steps that, let's say I say, hey, I have my project. Let's say our graduates, right? They have their project and they say, okay, I want to do continuous integration for the first time. What's the first step to like do continuous integration? Like picking the platform, right? So how do we go about that? What platforms are there available? How do you pick your platform, like for your own projects? Let's tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different platforms that you can pick. And just to make a point of distinction right here. So like the place where you put your code, right, is going to be your repository. And sometimes whatever service or platform that you're using for that repository also has continuous integration features in it. But sometimes it's not necessarily that way. And you can also use two separate systems, right? You could use GitHub for your repo, and then you could use something like TeamCity for your continuous integration, right? So a few names out there of services or platforms that you could use are, there's TeamCity, there's Circle CI, there's CodeShip, there's GitLab, which is what I've used professionally before, that has great CI tools. But probably the most common one that's available out there these days that you can start using right away and for free is GitHub Actions, right? So Juan, give a little bit of what GitHub Actions is and why is it so cool?
Yeah, so it's really cool because so each of these systems have their own way to configure things. So keep that in mind. So it's not as easy as like, let's say I set my steps and I pick a system and it just works on all the systems out there. No, each system has their own proprietary API or their own manifest structure. Usually it's a YAML file, or sometimes it's done from the UI. Like some systems from the UI lets you set the different steps and there's no manifest. It's configured just virtually. So your project, your repo does not know about it. But the common way is that your repo is aware of it. So your repo has some folder or some file. Let's say you're using Jenkins, you have some set of YAML files somewhere, maybe in the repo or in another repo to configure that. So with GitHub Actions, the nice thing is that it lets you run for free. It has like they have some tiers, of course, but for open source, usually they provide like just unlimited everything. I mean, I don't know the details, but other companies do that too. For example, Travis CI is very popular with open source. So you will see a lot of Travis CI builds because they're open source projects. But if it is not open source, it has a cost. GitHub has some free hours. GitLab has some free hours, but if it is an open source project, I think it's unlimited too, or they have some other limits. They are changing their policies all the time. So when it comes to GitHub Actions, the nice thing is that it's built in, right? So if you're using GitHub, it's kind of like a no-brainer to go with GitHub Actions because it's very easy to configure. So the first thing you need to do, you can create what's called, you go to the GitHub Actions tab, and there's something there that says create workflow or new workflow, and that just creates a YAML file that is going to have the different steps. So you'll have to go read some tutorials on how to define the steps. But literally, you have some sections, for example, like, okay, on an event, so on a push event, run, and you can tell it the steps, like run yarn, and you can give it a name, and then you can check out the branch. I mean, you have all the different steps you configure to what it takes to configure the build. And let me tell you, it's going to take a lot of trial and error. You're going to like configure and trigger the build, maybe by doing a commit, and then test it, and it fails and you get an error, then you fix it until you get it right. Because the first time it's not like it just works the first time, because each project is unique and has different steps. But once you have it, at least checking out the code and running the test, following that, then you can configure like what it takes to build your application. But the very nice thing about GitHub Actions is that it's built in. So because it's built in, then it's easier because it has everything you need ready to check out your own code using pre-configured actions that they provide. If you're using a different system, let's say you're using Bitbucket, they have something called pipelines. It's built in. If you're using GitLab has its own built-in agents. If you are using, I think those are the main platforms, but you can also use other platforms, Jared, as you mentioned. You can use Bitbucket with Circle CI or GitHub with Travis. Like you can integrate, and that integration works through something called Git webhooks. So research about webhooks, but webhooks, that's what it communicates between these systems. It triggers, it says like, hey, look, I was just pushed, and then it lets the other system know that they need to go check out the code. So that's kind of like how it works at level. But yeah, let's talk about GitHub Actions, Jared, more in detail. I know you've been configuring some this week and last week, and I configured like a couple like last week. In fact, like if you go check my Twitter, I have a tweet where I point to some GitHub Actions in my GitHub that I created. So it's like a starting point to give you an idea. But yeah, let's talk more about that. So when we start building, like first our GitHub action, right, or our continuous integration has to check out the code, right? So what are the steps? Like we check out the code, and then what do we do, right? What are the different steps to say like this finished?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I mean, for GitHub Actions specifically, there's a couple ways to get it started. One way is you can go through the UI and say, yes, create a workflow. Alternatively, you can just simply if you create a .github folder, and then inside of there, if you can add a YAML file, .yml, and inside of there, you can start defining the workflow that needs to take place when you push some commit. And what's important is you can also specify which branches that this file will be triggered based on. And then once there is a commit that triggers a build, then you get to define what the steps are. So the very first step usually that takes place is to clone the repository. So again, remember the whole idea of this continuous integration is that it's a clean state. So it's going to do a fresh clone from your repository. And then if you do have any sort of environment variables that are required for your project, and assuming that they're not front-end environment variables, which are okay to be displayed on there. But if you're building back-end projects, it's very important that you keep those in your GitHub secrets, which are in your settings. But anyway, you can inject the environment variables, which normally would come in through an environment file. Anyway, from that standpoint, we would then run either yarn install or npm install, depending on what you're doing. Check out our previous episode on npm versus yarn to learn more about that. And once it then installs all of those dependencies, it'll go through some sort of some build process. So if you look at your package.json, it'll likely have some sort of build or production build script that you can run. And all of these scripts are being run in order that you define in these YAML file. And at any point, if one of these fails, the whole pipeline is then going to stop and not continue, right? So, but if you do get past installing and you do get past building, and then the next step is usually going to be running some suite of tests, unit tests or integration tests or any other tests that you have set up. Just worth noting, you can add other types of tests in this stage as well. Like there's code quality tests that you can run, and also syntax style review that you can also run. Anyway, assuming that all of that gets through, then you're going to get a nice little check mark that says, hey, this code is ready to be merged in to the main branch or the master branch. So that's kind of like the set of steps there. But like, Juan, tell me a little bit about how, like on a team, when we're usually going to be reviewing each other's code through a pull request, how is CI useful in a team environment?
Yeah, you're thinking exactly the same I was thinking. I was thinking like, we need to share what's really the value of all this effort, right? To configure all this and constantly get the running. So the value is that you as a developer, when you're building something and you push to the branch before you create your PR, or when you create your PR, if you see that your build is not passing, you get a red check or something there. Then you know immediately that hey, I cannot even create a PR because this is not building, something's wrong. So that means that you're going to fix it and you're not even going to bother your team. So you're saving time. And time is money when it comes to productivity and to companies, right? So you're not distracting the team. So that's really good because that really helps create these high performing teams. That's the first thing. The second thing is that let's say it's passing and you send the PR, but once you send it, maybe you need to rebase or merge from master because you have conflicts. And let's say you do that, and that conflict creates another breaking change that it will create a failing build. Let's say maybe we had a syntax check, that's called linting, and maybe you have a new violation after you solve the conflict. That's going to just fail there and you didn't notice maybe. So then what it's going to do now is, let's say you already have your PR created. What's going to do is that your team, let's say when I review PRs, the first thing I do is I open the PR and the first thing I look is at the checks. If it is red, I'm like, hey, fix it. I'm not going to even look at any of the code until it's passing. So that pretty much within 5 seconds, I know if this PR is really ready for review or not. So that really makes it easy. Why? Because as an engineer, you don't want to spend, let's say, 20, 30 minutes reviewing a large PR and then find out that, hey, this is broken and maybe the fixes is going to change entirely the snapshot of what I just reviewed, right? So that means I just wasted 30 minutes of productivity that could have been used better. So that's really the great value of that. But really the best part of it is that, and that's why it's called continuous integration, that we can continuously integrate our code changes with high confidence. Of course, our continuous integration is just as good as our steps in our pipeline. If we don't have, let's say our continuous integration is just npm install and that's it, there's no confidence there. I mean, we know, no, the confidence is a little bit. We know that at least the modules install. At least we know we have a good package.json, right? A typo in a package.json or an extra comma, it's going to break npm install. So we know at least, you see that? We have that confidence that at least those pieces work. But of course, we want to have testing, right? We want to have some test coverage. At least unit testing, like npm install or the module dependency install, the build, right? The build production mode or the build of the project, and then running the testing. Those 3 steps are the crucial fundamental steps to have a good continuous integration pipeline. Other than that is add-ons that can make it better, like linting, but linting is optional. You don't have to do linting to still have high confidence. Linting is more about maintainability, okay? But yeah, that's really the great value there, that you can just merge things fast and know that it works. And once you merge, it's gonna automatically run in master and it's gonna check again in a brand new state and know if the changes are good. Because sometimes we merge to master and then something broke. And that happens because maybe I merged my changes and someone else was merging their own changes and maybe they did it and then mine came in. There was no conflict, so I didn't have to rebase, but the 2 changes happened to be conflicting for some reason, right? Maybe different function calls or that happens a lot. So it's going to break and we'll know oh crap, we broke it. What happened? Oh yeah, we defined this variable and I overrode it here and we didn't know about each other, right? So that happens too. So that's very important. But yeah, I'm going to take a break here to share our Twitters so we can, so you can stay in touch, right? You can reach out, we can talk, and we can, yeah. So this is Jared's Twitter.
Yeah, everybody can follow me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. Yeah, feel free to follow me and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, we have people reaching out asking questions about things, especially in DMs. I feel like closing the DMs, so then they just tweet about it, and it's more of an open conversation. So that's something that we wanted to try out. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. We'll have links to our profiles in the whatever platform you're listening this on, right? If you're on Spotify or YouTube or whatever, just find our links and you can just click there and follow us. I'm at Juan Lizarazo G. So that's twitter.com/JuanLizarazo. And you might be wondering, why do we share our Twitters on every episode? The reason is because this is just our way in order to get in touch, right? We could do email, but it's just like, it's easier to have a conversation here. And also, like, something that I like is that we have a way to always go back and see, like, oh, I remember I tweeted about it, I need that link, and we can find things back easy, and we have the thread. So it's really like a nice way to get in touch. But yeah, so continue with the continuous integration part. There, let's talk about the part when, like, the other steps that you and I mentioned, Jared. So these add-on steps. So static analysis. I think we talked in another episode about static analysis, but why, like, let's talk about the benefit on that, on automating that. Like, why would I want to run linting as part of my continuous integration process? Or why would I want to run, let's say, for example, there's other static analysis tools that we can use. For example, well, not static analysis, but for example, code coverage. One of the steps we can add is code coverage. For example, we can report if our code coverage went up or went down, or we can even block the PR from being merged if the code coverage went down more than certain threshold. So then we know that, hey, you added code, but you didn't add tests to it, right? Other benefit of that, of course, is like, one, if the tests break, then it's gonna block the build from passing, and it's gonna prevent from merging. But what other things can we add, Jared? Like, what do you think, like, we can add to continuous integration? Virtually, what is it possible? Do you think there's a restriction of what we can add on those steps, or we can just add anything we can think of?
Well, I mean, theoretically, of course, we could add whatever we would like. But I mean, there is, to some extent, some amount of a limit to what you do want to add or what you want to focus on. Because if you add too much, then it might just become a giant headache to get anything built or to get anything through the pipeline. Or if you're the person who's creating this for your team might not like you very much. But one little quick note I want to add, for anyone who doesn't know what code coverage is, or test coverage, and we're definitely going to have more episodes on testing specifically, but it just has to do with, like, keeping track of how many lines of code have you actually tested, right? Have you written tests that cover every line of code, and which lines have you not covered? The goal is 100%. But realistically, it's not always there. But yeah, a CI tool can help us keep track of how many lines of code, right? So if someone created a big PR and had a bunch of changes, but then didn't add any tests, then that code coverage percent over the whole project is going to go down. And you can set limits to say, hey, if it dips below a certain level, we can say that, hey, no, this isn't good enough, and we can tell it to stop the build. I would imagine, just to get to your original question about things you could add, I mean, I would imagine you could also add a check for that says, hey, if someone's trying to merge something in and there's no test files or no additional things being added, that's also a reason to fail it, right? It's not good enough.
Yeah, where I was going with that, and you nailed it, is that we can virtually add anything to continuous integration. Anything you can think of that you can run in your own computer through a terminal, you can add as a continuous integration step. So that's really good because it's flexible, so you can adapt and it works for any project. Really, like in 2021, there's no excuse. If your project does not have continuous integration, it's your fault, because there's no excuse. There's so many systems, free systems, and you can any step that adapts to any system, any platform, not just JavaScript, really, because you can run anything. The other thing, of course, is that this could be dangerous, as Jared mentioned, is that you want to limit it. You don't want to, because you can do everything. You don't want to do everything. Like, for example, hey, I want to check that there's a specific space at the beginning of every file, because that's what I like. Right? You don't want to do that because you're working with a team. Don't make it too strict. Like even if you have linting, don't make the linting too strict. For example, let's say you have that your properties must be ordered alphabetically. Something like that. That's too strict. That's going to drive people crazy. So you want to be not so strict, but things that actually provide value through automation. Okay. And that's, yeah. And that's really like the high level part of like the continuous integration and just the process. So Jared, what I want to do now in the time we have left, like some interview questions that could come up with these, because these continuous integration sometimes comes in interviews, right? They ask you like, do you know about continuous integration? Do you know how to set up a pipeline, right? So possible questions, we're not going to answer them, but let's give them some example questions that our audience can then go and find the answer for that of things that come up in interviews. So I'm going to give a few. I'm going to give four or five. Let's do 4 or 5 each. So one, what is continuous integration, right? So two, what systems for continuous integration have you used before? How do you define continuous integration? This one comes with the manifest. So remember the manifest, the steps. What is a pipeline? Do you know how to create pipelines? Okay, I covered 5 there. Jared, give us other 5.
Let me think of a few here. You got all the easy ones, but what you might be asked, what is CI/CD as a question, or what's the difference between CI and CD? Just as a related point, you could be asked, what is continuous deployment versus continuous delivery, which I know is not specifically for this course, for this episode, but something to consider. Whether or not you just have any experience with them, or if you haven't. And also maybe just like they might ask you point blank, like what's the value of this, right? They might try to pose the question as like, why do we need these extra steps, right? So these are really important questions to be able to answer and to explore. And yeah, just to a point is, we talked about GitHub Actions, and I would highly recommend, as kind of a challenge for students out there, to go and spend 20 or 30 minutes setting up a little workflow in GitHub Actions on a Git repository, right? You'd be surprised at how easy that is to set up.
I was going to ask the same. I was going to say, you need to do like before your next interview, go at least and set up a GitHub action or a Bitbucket pipeline or whatever system you're using, a Circle CI, like Travis CI, set a pipeline where you at least do an NPM install. Start there. And once you do that, you'll be like, okay, let's try to run the test now. Oh, that works. And that's going to give you a good sense of how easy it is. But that exposure, because usually really what a potential employer wants is like to know if you are familiar with it or you have some experience. So once you do it once, you can say like, yeah, I've set up a couple, right? I have some experience. I'm not an expert, but I have some experience. So that's going to be highly valuable. And the reason is because this is what everybody's using, and not because it's trendy, but because this is the only way we can build high performing teams and high maintainable code bases where we can integrate code changes fast and keep the pace, right, with this world that is ever changing, right, in the software industry. So that's it, really. I mean, I don't have anything else to share, so we can just do a quick recap, Jared, and call it a day.
Yep, sounds great. Yeah, to kind of recap a little bit, we talked about continuous integration, and just a quick high-level point of what that is just the process of making sure that code changes that we're making are able to integrate or merge cleanly into some remote repository that's shared by your team, right? We talked about the specific steps that you can define in a manifest file or the UI of whatever platform you're using of, check it out, install it, build it, what have you, run tests. We talked about the value that we gain through the process of adding continuous integration, not just to your project and the code quality, but also to your experience and the skills that you have. Juan, what are some of the other points we talked about?
Yeah, we mentioned different platforms, right? So remember, with us, you have homework. We're not going to turn you into an expert. We expose you. Our episodes are very dense, so we expose you to as much as we can for a related topic on the things you should know now. Go on Google and learn everything you can for your next interview. So we talked about, GitHub Actions, Bitbucket pipelines, the manifest, right? The steps. There's also Azure DevOps. That's another free one you can use. We talked about the different the process, right? Like what happens that we're running things in a remote machine, that it can be a container or a computer. Is called a minion or an agent. Usually is build agents right? You're going to see that like in the different platforms. There's also, we talked about Git hooks, right? So, or Git web hooks. Go research everything you can so you understand better how these things communicate to each other. We talked about creating actually the build, a passing build, a failing build, no status, right? I didn't mention the status badges, but you have seen those status badges in the projects in the README. Those come from continuous integration. And yeah, I mean, we talked about some interview sample questions. I think that's it. I mean, we probably covered other things here and there, but you just heard the episode, so you better be taking notes so you can just Google what you need to. But yeah, that's really it for today. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the Bootcamp Live, where we help you level up so you land your first job and become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo,
And I'm Jared Potter.
and we'll see you next week.
Take care.